MLR? Anybody know? It's just, it's the same as sort of as LRMI. So it's simply metadata learning resources. So it's just another piece. So they often get confused back and forth. How about this one? DC? And I'm not talking Washington. Dublin Core. Thank you. SCORM. Here's for the bonus points. Anybody remember what SCORM stands for? Shared Content Object Resource Metadata. So SCORM. How about LRMI? That's what you're here to learn. Yeah. Well, what does it stand for? Anybody know? Thank you. There we go. You got, oh, Learning Resource Metadata Initiative. What did you say? Interface. Interface? I like that. That's very cool. There we go. And then QTI? QTI, nobody knows? Part of SCORM? So that's the actually has to do with assessment items and development of those assessment items. I think it's actually, I was trying to remember what QTI is now that I brought it up there. I don't know, but in fact, in the end, this is what it's all about, OMG. There are so many of these different standards. So an important question is, why LRMI? So we'll try to get at some of that today. So LRMI is actually the result of sort of this perfect storm that's coming together. The goal making it easier and more convenient to get access to the resources. And that sort of perfect storm is really these three pieces coming together. One is curriculum standards, so we now have some level of national standards, not national. I'd be careful how I say that, right? I can get in trouble with some people. But we have, some level. We have schema.org, so we have a standardized way of thinking about metadata. And then we also have this concept of technologies of a learning registry, or a registry of some sort that allows us to have a distributed index of metadata. So these three pieces come together and give us this opportunity to really do something that we haven't been able to do previously. So why do we need this standard to describe instructional resources? There are already so many of them that exist out there. And I like to think about it this way. For some of you in the room have known me for a long time, so everything gets related back to food. And if you think about it, so here is describing something not as a recipe in terms of amount, but this is all the ingredients that I'm going to put in something, and we all know it's really good because it has bacon in it. But we don't know much about this in terms of being an intelligent consumer of the resource, of the thing you're making. So in the last 2 decades, we've seen the emergence of this. And many of you probably recognize this as being part of sort of what you see on almost every package. How many of you use that to inform your actual consumption of food? Yeah, so I mean, I'm diabetic, so I really like to know how many carbs are in that thing that I'm going to be eating. The previous recipe doesn't tell me. This actually gives me information, so I am a more informed consumer of food now. Well, in fact, LRMI is really intended to help make us all better consumers of instructional media, instructional resources, and do so in a way that's really helps us really think intelligently about that. So, why do we need this? Really to improve search. And of course, it's not just about improving search. It's kind of like that old fishing myth, why don't they call it fishing, not catching? Well, in this case, it shouldn't be about search. It's about finding things, and it's really about sort of improving what it is that we actually find. So if you go out to Google today, and I actually updated this screen. You'll be happy to know, Dave. So if you go out to Google today and you go search on potato salad, you can do it if you have it in front of you there. And you go out, you'll actually see a recipes menu, and you can select that, and then you can actually select search tools, and what you get is this list up here. It says ingredients, any cook time, any calories, so you can get a variety of different kinds of metadata, and if I do this drop down, it lets me select whether I do or don't want something. So I love the fact I selected no potatoes, but it has to have Miracle Whip. So it's got to be good for you, right? So, but I have the ability here to actually actively, make some selections around that have to do with a recipe, not just generically. I don't care what date the recipe was. That's sort of a generic Google search. This gives me the opportunity to look at specific data. This is schema.org. This is the piece that LRMI is part of. About 10 weeks ago, is that a reasonable estimate, Dave? If we're counting?
Yeah.
Probably 2 months ago. LRMI officially became part of schema.org. And so this kind of metadata can potentially now become available as part of the search made available by some of the very large search engines. And it's up to them about how they want to implement it. But schema was actually put together by Yahoo, Bing, Yandex, I always forget one. Who did I forget? Google. Imagine that right in front of me. So, and so they may in fact look at implementing now that data in terms of how do I actually find this. So the ability then to be able to search, imagine instead of ingredients and cook time, being able to say, I want something for a child of this age, I want it for them working in pairs, I want this to be addressing this particular Common Core standard or this particular learning style. So I have the ability then to be able to go out and do that search. It also underlies the Learning Registry and a number of other ways that we can describe learning resources. But if we look today, the echo in this room is kind of interesting. I feel like I should be playing that, God in that Noah script or something. So if you look at most metadata today, this is a whole long list of SCORE metadata prior to the adoption of LRMI. There was nothing about learning in there. And so that's the importance of the LRMI, is actually adding that learning component to this. And the LRMI is actually a joint relationship between the Creative Commons, working with open education resources, and the Association of Educational Publishers, working with those that are creating other content, often for fee or for some other kind of use as well. So these two organizations are working together to really see the adoption of the LRMI. An example of what I think makes the LRMI really powerful, for those of you who've gone to the Museum of Modern Art in New York, is if you go there, you'll actually see at least two different descriptions. There's actually a description for children too, which I actually really enjoy. But in fact, two of the major ones intended for adults. One is this visual description for people who are visually impaired. And this actually tells them access to collection, audio descriptions. It'll tell you the size, the paint strokes that are there. If you think about our usual kind of metadata that we use, it tells you the size of the book, how many pages it is, how many pictures it has. Right? That's all the boring stuff about a resource. That's interesting if you sort of need to put in a bid to be able to make the book. But it's not, it has nothing to do with about the instructional value. The things that we look at when we go to MoMA is we're interested in things about the collection, about commentaries by the artist, by the curator, by others who are actually using that. And that's where the LRMI really adds a lot of value. It has to do with actually the nature of teaching and what's taking place. So I think it's important to think about LRMI as adding in that component that really makes it live. So the challenge that we have that underlies this whole process is that teaching, if you ask 10 educators what they're trying to achieve with a resource, you'll typically get 15 different answers. Right? I mean, I'm still a credentialed teacher. I can talk smack about our profession. There's, there's sort of a lack of consistency around some of that. And I think our challenge around this whole tagging process is, as Ansel Adams said, there's nothing worse than a sharp image of a fuzzy concept. And that really is this process of searching and what we need to get our arms around as we're looking at implementing LRMI and search and some of those pieces. And my colleagues here are thinking about those kinds of issues as it has to do with supporting greater access to their instructional resources. So there are some major components to the LRMI. First of all, it inherits a lot of things from schema right here. So these are items that are part of regular schema.org. Standard things that have nothing to do with learning, specifically title, URL, description, image, creation date, publisher, etc. Almost anything might have that. They also have educational terms, and these are more specific to learning. So we're going to go through these in a little bit more detail for a moment. There's also some competency-related pieces related to instructional standards, so we'll talk about those as well. So if we take a look at intended user role, these are users as identified within what are considered recommended vocabulary. Important just to step back for a second that schema actually sort of believes mostly in group sourcing, in crowdsourcing. So if you look at recipes, it assumes that the world of people who post recipes are going to figure out the best way to do that and what terminology to use. We'll call an egg, and we'll call flour, and we'll figure that out. Unfortunately, as I said before, in education, we don't sort of have we don't seem to come to some consistency. We use words in rather, ways where there's overlap and not consistent usage. So what we did is we came up with a recommended set. This is not a controlled vocabulary. It's not a required vocabulary. It's simply some suggestions, just because there's a greater chance that if two people use the word administrator, that they might actually find each other. So that's part of the goal. And this will continue to evolve. In fact, one of the meetings that we have at the conference tomorrow afternoon at 5:15 is talking about governance and how we're going to continue to evolve the specification. So if you don't like these terms, get involved. We can change them. You can add whatever you want whenever you want to do it. So this is intended user role for the resource. We also have much smaller printing. Educational use, and a number of different ways that you might use that. Again, and all of this, by the way, is up on the LRMI website, and we can give you that URL. Feel free to take a picture, but it's going to be tough to read. So it's all available there. You can see the kinds of educational use, thinking again about not so much the resource as it is the instructional use of the resource as being the key component here. So another attribute here is interactivity type. Interactivity type, please don't quote me on this, it sucks, to use a technical term. This actually was acquired from, I think it was an IEEE spec. And so, you sit down with a publisher and we're talking to people about, okay, is it active or expositive? Their answer is, I don't know. And for most educators, that's not all that useful. This is part of the governance change. They drew on existing standards that were out there. We think this is insufficient. And so we expect that this is going to continue to change and evolve over time. Another is media type. This still remains rather controversial about whether it's something that we need and how we might use it. Part of it is the ambiguity between some of the terms that we use. We associate some of them with media and some with a particular instructional type of resource. So there's some ambiguity. Again, pieces that we need to hash out if we're going to be able to make sense out of this. This is that Ansel Adams fuzziness that is problematic. Another is typical age range. We ended up not doing grade very, very purposefully. And that is that this is a standard not just for the US, this is a standard for international use. If you internationally say grade 3, first of all, some countries don't have grade. And other ones don't think 3 is the same as 3 is someplace else. So they're all different. So we stuck with age. A lot easier. Kids seem to grow age by age, regardless of where you are on the earth. I guess if you're going close to the speed of light, it changes, but that's a different story altogether. Age is actually listed there, and this may get implemented a little bit differently in terms of ranges instead of just specific, or having specific ages, but be able to cite high and low. We don't know how that will continue to evolve, but it certainly will. Another one here is learning resource type. So this is actually the resource itself. Is it online, podcast, presentation? Different from media type, which is more about the distribution. So looking at differentiating between those two, nature of the learner engagement there. And then we have this alignment type, and the alignment type really has to do with standards. So traditionally when we think about standards, not technical standards, but things related to teaching, we think about instructional standards like Common Core. And that is the case here. And if you have a Common Core standard, they're actually referenced to use something called the dot notation. So there's a dot notation associated with each of the Common Core standards. We're also in conversation with the group at the next generation science standards. We're also looking at international standards. We're continuing to evolve that to reach beyond that. The funding from Gates has been for Common Core, and that's the reason we've gone with that. But you can also indicate, does a resource assess, teach, or does it require? Is it a prerequisite for that particular standard? So I can say, I have this resource, I need to have this knowledge to be able to use it, and it'll help me teach this particular concept as I'm working with a student, or assess this particular concept. But it's important to recognize that standard in this technical sense has a much broader use. It could be any kind of standard. So one of the conversations that we have, how many of you are familiar with a company called Metametrics? Is that a company you know? So Metametrics does something called reading comprehension level, or Lexiles. And a Lexile is a measure of reading comprehension level, so it has a number associated with it. Well, in fact, it is a standard, just not a curriculum standard. And so that will be referenced actually here as maybe a reading level standard, and it will have a number or a banded number associated with that. People ask about having a topic list. Well, a topic list could be a standard. So I have a standard way that I want to organize things, and I want to map it back to that resource. So this is a very extensible type of object and can be used in a whole variety of different ways. So don't think just curriculum standard, think broader standard in terms of how that gets used. So the actual act of tagging really just consists of these 3 steps. One is actually selecting, including your materials within some sort of tagging application. And Eric, who's raised his hand in the back of the room, has created one of those. We'll take a look at another one of those today. Eric's at Agilent. So then once you've tagged it and described the resource, you can then publish it. And that publishing can happen either within an instructional resource. So for those of you who are producing content, you can include that as microdata in the header of your web-based material so that it can be pulled once things are crawling the web for that. Another one is to push that information out to the Learning Registry. And so it's another place where that information can live and be distributed out elsewhere. So you can make that available, and we expect there'll be more places where that'll happen, particularly when we look internationally. And the last step is then actually conducting a search. And we'll take a look at a search that's been developed by a group out of Illinois to see the kind of work that they're doing and how that's actually being used. So, I'll take a breath. Oh, there's the process. I knew I forgot the arrows. And let me turn this over to Marti Heyman.
You should take a breath. All right, my family would be stunned if my voice didn't carry because they always tell me to be quiet. But can you hear me all right? All right. Okay, so I'm part of Cengage. Cengage publishes quite a variety of learning materials for K-12, for higher ed, for professional, as well as trade. We also bring to the market the Gale research and reference content that are accessible through school, academic, and public libraries. So we're a company that is all about learning. That is our primary focus. So why would we want to participate in this effort? Well, certainly we're looking all the time for ways to support the identification by educators of potential content or learning assets that they might want to use, whether they're free for use or to be purchased. That said, we are a for-profit company, so obviously as my role as on the hook for our descriptive metadata for all of our products, I want our products, our content, to surface at the top of a generic web search and not somewhere down in the thousands where most people won't get to. As an adjunct instructor at Drexel University, I can really appreciate how frustrating it can be to run a query at Google, like, oh, I want to do a new and different exercise to get at this learning objective to achieve these results. And so I'm going to go out and see what other educators in my field might have done. Of course, I'm going to start at a generic search so I can either identify universities where those educators have made their materials available, or perhaps a for-profit publishing house that clearly publishes content that I may be interested in. So I understand from both sides the interest in having relevant content come to the top and not just because a keyword hit. Also, we're committed to doing what we can to accelerate the movement towards personalized learning. And so metadata standards that call for an element that specifies learning style very much appeals to us, along with many of the others. So how are we going about implementing this? So first, just did a basic crosswalk between our existing, fairly robust internal standards around our metadata and how's it mapped to LRMI, the pseudo-required minimum fields. We discovered significant overlap, which wasn't too much of a surprise. You know, the usual things, essentially bibliographic citation type elements that you would expect. I was pleased to see LRMI stepped out and called for a topic or subject, knowing how gnarly that can be in terms of having that field get populated with meaningful data. So for the existing metadata fields, we're going to simply create the new elements, the LRMI specified elements, and programmatically populate them with the data already populated in our Cengage variant of that field. So that should be quite easy and straightforward to do. Then for the new metadata, I'm in a position where I can't just pull the trigger, since I'm not on the profit loss side of the house. I don't get to make the publishing decisions or the product decisions. I get to influence them. So it's on me to do a bit of a cost-benefit analysis of adding and then populating these relatively new fields. The great news is several of them were ones that we've been talking about as a company for a while, not the least of which is Common Core standards and associating our content with those standards, so that as an educator, you have the ability to understand coverage of, in any digital course perhaps that you've assembled, coverage of the standards that you want to cover, as well as potentially, depending upon what digital learning environment you might be using, run a report to understand performance of your students against those standards. So having that metadata there is obviously fairly critical. So in terms of the next steps, we get the framework in place. Then we also need to understand the value of tagging or indexing legacy content. So do we want to put a stake in the ground and go forward with all new assets generated as of July 1st, we'll do it? Or is there a window that makes business sense based on usage as well as dollars to make our previously published content accessible via LRMI elements or not? And it's for the most part dollars and cents to determine that. And again, I get to influence the decision and provide the data and suggestions, but ultimately not in my hands. It is in my hands to revise our extensive policies and learning aids, job aids, all the sorts of materials that go into including a fairly robust awareness or communications campaign to make sure that across the company, the people in roles that need to know are aware that we now have these additional metadata elements and that we treat them, we've adopted them as our internal standard and treat them as seriously as we treat our existing internal standards. So we will be doing that. Nothing like a little change management. So to finish up my part, it was interesting as we went through this, and I did a few of the C-level communications and then the mid-level, relatively mid-level publishers, trying to get them on board, make them aware of what we're looking at, trying not to let it be technology driving a solution rather than the business driving a solution. And one of the conversations, two of the conversations we had are left open as open-ended questions that we still haven't tackled. One of which is, how will we measure success? Do we need to measure success? But one of the routes to measuring success would be is tracking online sales as a result of catalog hits that were referenced or referred to the catalog, our online product catalog, from a generic web search. It certainly can do that. Is it worth doing it? Right? So it's an interesting question, whether or not to gather that data and create a baseline story that other publishers may or may not want to take advantage of. Actually, LRMI take advantage of to get more publishers on board. So that would be my bias to do that. And the other piece is, as a publisher, for both our Gale reference and research, as well as the educational learning assets, what's the smallest level or unit that will sell? So that, you didn't have much time to look at all of the metadata elements, but you could really get very granular. One example I had was we could get down to the level of an article within an encyclopedia instead of just that encyclopedia. Encyclopedia Judaica, great, here's your 22 volumes, go find your answer. Instead, it's not only volume 26 or at page 3, here's the article, and you could purchase that article. Instead of, and so for us, that's a big change in the business model.
Yeah, my name is Heyman. I'm the CEO from Players. We're an enterprise search engine. We score is semantic technology, and therefore many of the standards that we are talking about. We come to the same approach. We're doing the same thing that we're doing, guys, here, but for products, for physical products, as Google is already indexing that schema.org. My question is Google also indexing the portion for education of the schema.org that you just, the LRMI? Because I know, as you said, the mail is part of the schema.org, but I know there are other portions that are also part of that, but it's still not being indexed, and therefore the search results do not display the necessary information.
Want me to address that?
Yes, please. Because I was going to say yes, but I bet you could be more.
Well, so we don't actually know which of those organizations is actually, what their plans are. I believe right now they're not indexing that. I think they're trying to determine how it's being adopted, how it's actually being used. I know we talk to them in several of those environments, but they don't share what's happening internally. I think it's important to recognize that the LRMI is useful regardless of whether those, it would be great when those search engines do, but there are other places that it's being applied even today.
Yeah, I don't have any doubts that they are going to start indexing that metadata, and it's going to solve eventually. Just was not sure whether they are doing it right now. That was my question.
Yeah, I think I'll stand with my answer.
Thank you.
And I'm glad you answered.
Okay. Thanks, Marty.
The source of misinformation. So, any other question, or should I just turn over one more? Not disrupt? Okay.
We were talking about the small student content to sell. Can you talk a little bit about the use of microtransactions to sell small pieces, and where are you with that?
Great question, and clearly that's the route we would need to go if there's a business decision made to shift the business model to support that. So right now I'd say we were at -10 because we're still thinking about it, let alone formulating a strategy and moving forward.
Great. Well, I'm Roger Rosen. I'm the president of Rosen Publishing. We have a classroom division and a library division and a database division, and we're publishing almost 1,500 books a year, all of which are e-books as well as print. We do about 5 or 6 major subscription databases as well. And as a board member of AEP, when Michael talked about LRMI, it was something that obviously got our attention, because we're dealing with metadata all the time and dealing with our various vendors. They require metadata in many different forms. It's incredibly laborious. I'm going to talk about this both from a publishing point of view, a business point of view, and resonate with much of what Marty said, because I think that we hadn't talked about it before. It's very congruent how we as an organization are thinking about this. Essentially, the reason we were so interested in embarking on LRMI and most importantly, devoting the resources to do the in-depth tagging, because there is an expense to having people so involved, is because we do see it as the most robust meta-tagging methodology, and we're hoping that more publishers come on board and that more vendors come on board so that we can stop the kind of balkanization of the process that we currently see. And the reason that's so important for us is that we too believe that the way of the future is the microtransactions and the customization. These are the 2 key points, I think, that have driven so much of our decision making. We're kind of an interesting case in point, I think, and probably why Michael asked me to speak. We're an independent publisher, started in 1950, and we are the traditional book publisher that has, over these past 15 years, I think rather successfully navigated into a digital context where we invested in the platforms to host especially our databases and our interactive ebooks and our PDF ebooks. And we have vast holdings that actually we own outright. So obviously, as we sell databases, as we work with different institutions, the number one issue is discoverability. So, it's just dead obvious that you want to use every technique at your disposal, as Marty said, to come to the top of the list to make the retrieval of the necessary data easy for teachers and students. And that's our goal in doing this in-depth meta tagging. Obviously, with the Learning Registry being on board from the Department of Education, we can see the impact of that in terms of material, getting feedback from them, as well as our pushing out our resources and having that material as part of the Learning Registry. So, I'm old enough in the sort of editorial field to think about the integrity of a given book, from front to back, from first chapter to last. I can speak about, the integrity of the narrative, and I have various views about that, but they really all don't count for a hill of beans, because ultimately it's all about, I think, the disaggregation of the data, the micro search, the micro transaction. Some people have asked me, have you got that business model totally down? And I would say no. It's something we're looking at. I mean, we've certainly had conversations with departments of education in Botswana and sort of various third world countries where there was a clear desire for a component of text rather than the entire offering. That sort of seems to be the place where this construct is of greatest interest at the moment. But obviously it's something that we will be dealing with and basically embracing it. And I see no reason not to embrace it. It is a different business model, but perhaps I have a minority view here, but I still believe in the printed book. I sell a lot of them, and I have a lot of users who find this delivery mechanism to still be very impactful and potent. I believe that entire databases, as we create them, will have utility. And I believe in strategic alliance with many of the vendors here who will be ingesting some of this content for dissemination in varied and sundry ways. And all of that has to be tracked and found. And because, like Marty, we are doing this not exactly as a hobby, try not to make it a hobby, we need to monetize it as well. And I think perhaps the basis of this is the LRMI tagging, because nothing happens without the discoverability. It's like your sales team always says, the circle isn't closed until it's sold. And it's, I think one could say in another context, the circle isn't closed until that which you've built is found. So that's really why we've been doing what we've been doing, and if you'd like to chat with me more about it, by all means do come by the booth or send me an email. But we're very engaged. We have a reasonably robust team in-house participating in this, and we're committed to the initiative. So, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Roger.
Yeah.
So you've chosen the right speakers when they talk about integrity and use the word gnarly. So it's definitely right on. So I want to give you one other example, and I mentioned that we would go here. And this is actually a group, the Illinois Shared Learning Environment. Anybody here from Illinois? Oh, there we go. Are you familiar with this?
I've heard about it.
You've heard about it. There we go. It's just a rumor. So here we go. Anybody have a particular word curricularly that they want to search for? So this isn't a loaded, any word? What was it? No.
Interactive.
There, it's all food. Well, but I was thinking more curricular wise. Let me put it work search on fraction. How's that? And I've done this before. So if you search on fractions here, and I apologize, it doesn't quite fit in that. What you see is 844 items come up, and you'll notice a lot of these look familiar. They've added actually some other metadata. So we have language. They have something called the career clusters that are important in Illinois organizationally. But here we have end user, grade level. They've actually done a mapping in their case from the LRMI tag about age to grade level. Again, I think it's a great use case. LRMI supports the age, and that way it can be translated wherever it's being used. Resource type, media type, group type. So a lot of these sound familiar, the kinds of pieces that we use within the LRMI. So I can actually go in here and say that the end user should be, let's see here, teacher. How's that? And what we see is that went down to 114 items within that. And I could say that the media type that I want, this is where it gets risky, right? It's like you're playing Russian roulette with the search. And these numbers here, by the way, are the total, not how many I'll actually get. So let's say that it is a software application. I'm not going to get too risky there. So that took us down to 14 items. So we have here fraction models, fraction games, student interactive, a whole series of these pieces. And I can then click in on these and give it a sec here to upload. And I can see all the metadata that's been associated with it. I can see a description. I can see the resource itself, and then I can click it and potentially go to that. And I can see who the creator was and all the other pieces that go with it. So here, this is actually an instance of the LRMI being applied within a node of the Learning Registry. So this is actually a node of the Learning Registry. They've actually put together in Illinois a group to tag not just working with publisher materials, but also OER materials, another important component. And my understanding is that, I guess this week, they were going to push live out to the Learning Registry about, what did they say, 310,000 resources that were going to be referenced out in this fashion. So you'd be able to have access to that. I do want to point out that a resource in schema.org terminology is not necessarily a book. I was looking for a book, and of course there's no book laying around. So it's not a book. It's it may be a component within the book. So when Marty was talking about the granularity, it might be far more granular than a book. It might be a particular lesson or several lessons that are put together. So it's often that smallest level that's referred to as a resource. So if anybody wants to select another item, we can go do another search.
Alamo?
Alamo. Yeah, let's see that. Maybe it'll come up with a car rental place. The Alamo. So 15 items found, Western expansion. I don't know that we need to. We could look at grade level. So I want something for 5th grade, let's say. Oh, 0 items. There we go. So 8th grade looks like it triggered and brought in the 1. And the Battle of the Alamo, many myths, et cetera, and you can see the creator, when it was created. You can see the access rights, that it's free. You can see that it's grades 8, but up through grades 11 and 12, and it has not been aligned to standards yet. So again, it's an evolving process. It's pretty new, but continuing to evolve. Any questions about this? And I probably can't answer, but go ahead.
Once you've identified a couple of these resources, if you have an LOR in an LMS,
Yeah.
can you import this into that so it becomes an object in your LOR?
So my understanding within this environment is no. So this doesn't take it that next step, but we certainly have conversations with several organizations that are looking at how to be able to use these kinds of tools based on LRMI to be able to support that kind of approach. We just had a conversation with an organization who assesses a student around a particular area and then wants to be able to recommend resources, not just to their own, but be able to point to the larger world of resources that are out there and be able to make that maybe part of an IEP or part of a learning strand for that particular learner. So, you know, again, I think what's important to separate is the spec and what's there versus the world of opportunity that exists. Now that that kind of data becomes available and we can base a lot on that. I think there's a lot of exciting stuff that's going to come from this. Let me go ahead and we'll leave a little bit of time at the end, for a little bit more Q&A. And I really do appreciate you being here at this hour. We were going to start taking bets as to how many people were going to be here. So this is great. Just quickly about the Association of Educational Publishers program, funded by the Gates Foundation. We through March of 2012. In April of this year, we did a lot of work around awareness building, collaboration on tagging, looking at educator publisher surveys, and encouraging the schema.org adoption, obviously successful in that, yay. And then also supporting publishers hands-on in terms of doing tagging. What we've done now is we moved into phase 3 is instead of actually doing tagging for publishers, we're actually now supporting publishers in doing tagging. And when I use that term publisher, I just want to make sure you're aware, it's in the broadest sense. It's any content creator. We're actually funded to do that, to work with them to help support them in that process. We're also looking at creating a sandbox, Learning Registry for publishers. Also looking at how we're going to govern this process. So again, I invite you to participate in that process. Also looking at how to support an LRMI ecosystem. So looking at service providers, many people go out to other organizations to either associate metadata with their resources. We're looking at how to expand that to include the LRMI. Also looking at those that are providing correlation services to standards and be able to incorporate that into their services. And also other kinds of content management systems and how do you manage that metadata. And then we're also continuing to survey the marketplace. So the state of LRMI right now, the properties are published as part of schema.org, yay. We're now working, Benetech, I don't know if there's anybody here from Benetech, I don't see, but they're here in the conference, are looking at the accessibility properties. So there's an extended set of properties that are part of the LRMI that have not yet been accepted by Schema that have to do with accessibility. And so other ways that you can tag resources. So that's coming down the pike. Right now there are 4,800 resources from publishers from this community other than OER that are included, and there are many, many, many more on the way. So some of the companies have been waiting for that adoption by Schema. Organizations are looking at ways to leverage the LRMI. That alludes to what I was mentioning before about other ways to use this kind of metadata. And there's an awareness increase from 47% last year to 86% this year. So significant awareness about the LRMI. That only bodes well for adoption down the road. And again, AEP received funding from Gates this last year. So the implications, I think, are key. Marti explicitly spoke to, and that was that it's not that the LRMI is just for use for tagging outside of an organization. And I don't care whether you're a school district that is looking technically, how do you describe resources within your structure, or if you're a publisher who's looking at your own internal metadata, there are some nice ways to leverage some of the good thinking that's gone on behind the scenes behind LRMI. So it's not just for topical use, not just use up here, but in fact use deep down potentially within your organizations to describe the resources. One of the organizations I just want to mention that we're working with also is In Bloom. In Bloom, you may be aware of, they also are working with the LRMI, and we're working very closely with them to be able to have the publishers help support publishers who are adopting LRMI, who then are going to be working within that In Bloom environment to be able to make the most use of this tagging and then paradata and other pieces associated with that. So lastly, I think, and this is really the guts of the whole thing, and that is that the LRMI really hopefully will help support a shift from moving from thinking about resources to thinking about learning. I mean, I think it's just horrible when you think about, what are you doing? I'm doing this resource. No. What you're doing is you're learning about something, and the resources there to support that process. And I think this helps disassociate that a little bit more, and you can apply the resource to the process. It also moves from being institutionally focused to being learner focused. So you don't think about sort of the large purchase, but think about how the learner's using that in an informed way to help support their learning. Also a move from thinking about media to thinking about how we're engaging the learner. It's not about video, it's about it being visual and understanding who that learner is and how they're engaging with it, or hands-on, or the nature of that engagement. And lastly, it's about moving, and we've seen this trend, from adopted resources to really discovered resources. And I think that's particularly key when it comes to really responding to the needs of learners. So with that said, I think we're at the end. So I do want to thank my colleagues, Marty and Roger, for presenting here as well. So I think that's it. If you have any questions. What time is it? Yes, question.
I'm guessing that the people are loading data with subjects, topics that are coming from different control lists. How is that, how are they integrated?
Do one of you want to answer that, or I can give it a shot too? Yeah, so in some cases, it's been a real tempting thing to want to create some sort of hierarchical structure. And the problem with doing that, the question was that people are using some sort of controlled list around sort of topic lists around curriculum, right? Some sort of organizational structure. The problem about using any one of those is they really imply some curricular relationship. And we try to really stay away from adopting something that takes a particular approach to that, but instead looking at how do you support that more generally. So what we're seeing is that gets embedded in many cases as a standard, but we haven't seen that used in that way yet, or gets in the description field within the resource itself as another place. Have you seen anything else, Dave, in terms of usage? Yeah, that's where we are right now. I think that's going to be one of the controversial topics that's going to come up, because in fact, we've had creators of content who say, yeah, but people want me to give them a topic list. And what we're saying is, yeah, but you may not like our topic list. So how we actually handle that. I know I got a nice communication from somebody about some bibliographic reference and how those are being used and how it's a nicely vetted list. But my tendency is to want to distance from adopting a list and instead really find a way to support the community using multiple lists and be able to tag them as they see fit. Does that?
Yeah, no, I can see the point of approaching it that way. So at the moment, if people put things in, they could just put in from any list.
They could just put it from any list at this point, absolutely. And I think that's always going to be the case. The question is whether it becomes a structured part of how the standard element is used. The properties are being used as part of that process. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Is the Illinois resource, the IO resource, that I might have been, is that live here?
I don't think it's out live. They were supposed to push it out live this week, and today's Monday of this week. So having developed things, that probably means Friday at 6 p.m., right? So I don't know when it's actually going to go live, but feel free to contact them. I think they'd be happy to hear from you and hear the interest. Yes?
So you mentioned that 4,800 publisher resources were tagged outside of OER.
Yeah.
What about inside OER?
We don't have a really good number on that right now. I mean, it's like a lot of OER. I mean, we know we've heard 310,000 from the Illinois group. I know that there's a group out of Benetech that's talked about somewhere around 30,000. But we don't have our arms around that, and we've tried to turn to our colleagues at Creative Commons to try to get our arms around that also. But I think, Dave, we haven't heard any numbers from them.
No, they've been working. Our point of contact in there was Greg Grossmeyer. He recently left, so we haven't had a good point of contact in there recently. But he was working with a couple of OER portals like OER Commons and a couple of those type folks to kind of work and get that integrated into their platforms. And I believe that was what he accomplished before he left, but I'm not sure what their status is right now.
So we hope to get better engaged and better informed in working with them on that. So we've been very clear what we've been able to accomplish. We haven't heard back from Creative Commons about that side. So stay tuned. Yes?
Does LRMI include any portions for rights management, like we are?
So the only thing that there is part of the regular schema properties, and that just has to do with just reporting what the access is, but we stay out of that completely. There are other standards out there that handle that, and other ways to describe it, and it doesn't work to benefit. We're not adding any educational value, I think, by handling that. We've certainly looked at groups like Let's and others who actually have some business models around some of those pieces, and how we might be able to work with them and bring in some of those components. So for those of you who don't know, the trick to helping move a standard ahead is to try to not bite off more than you can possibly chew, and really try to constrain it nicely. Otherwise, it sort of becomes everything to everybody. So I can point to lots of standards that have been unsuccessful because they tried to be everything to everybody. So we're trying to keep it nice and clean. Yep, you bet. Other questions? Let me grab in the back and then I'll come back to you. Yes?
Just wondering if this presentation is available anywhere after the session?
Do you want it to be? Okay, yes. I thought maybe you wanted us to destroy it or for the common good. Yeah, I think we'll make it available on the LRMI site, and I don't know how soon that'll go up, but yeah, we'll get it up there through just look for LRMI. Yeah, you bet. Your question up here.
So you said the AEP, that was founded by the Gates Foundation?
No, so the AEP has been around for 60 plus years, longer, Dave?
Well, if you want to get technical, it's over 100. We were founded in 1895, but we won't go back that far.
Yeah.
We've been AEP since I think 94, 95. Yeah, I can
So
talk.
what part did you say that the Gates?
So we've been funded by the Gates Foundation to communicate and to coordinate around LRMI and the educational resource industry.
I see, so the Gates Foundation gave a grant to
Yeah.
push the,
Yeah, so we're supported to, well, we're funded to support publishers who are interested in tagging to LRMI in any way we can, which includes giving talks like this and consultations and things like that. Mhm.
Any other questions? Well, I think you deserve to be let go. Thank you so much for coming. If we can answer any